All right. So was that the Lion King or something introducing us?
Yeah.
I mean, that was a little bit. It's a tough act to follow. Politics in America with Nigel Farage. But we're gonna make this. This is gonna be substance.
We can
do this. You know, I thought we would start our conversation here by actually defining a bit the terms, largely because I don't understand them. But I think if I don't, then there's at least one or two people who don't as well. But I also think it will help us to fashion the discussion. What do we? I'm going to start with you, Scotty. What do we? When we talk about digital trade, what does that encompass to your mind?
Well, you know, people think of digital trade and they don't really appreciate that it's not just new technology. It is new technology, but it's old technology too. It's everything that enables what we do. So it's how we communicate with each other, but it's also, you know, video games, music, e-publications, transactions. And so digital trade, it's actually $27.7 trillion worth of economic activity last year alone.
27.7 trillion.
That's right.
Okay. So is this how you, Matt, I mean, when you look at it, you're obviously involved in defining this as part of your conversation with your friends in the European Union.
Yeah.
How do you look at it?
Well, I think it's difficult to put a precise limitation on what's digital trade, right? So increasingly, all trade has data underpinning it. Increasingly, trade in services especially requires an ongoing relationship. And so ultimately, the underpinning of digital trade is the ability to transfer data and the free flow of data. So when we think of it from a policy point of view, we're thinking about how do you remove the barriers to trading with another country. And in the digital space, that essentially comes down to the rules around privacy and the protection of data at its core. But then it is also an underpinning element of every other part of trade. You know, if you're selling some very old school product, say you're selling a car right across the European Union, if you have to hold a separate customer database in each country separately because of data, because of rules around private information, then that's going to be much more inefficient than if you can just store that once.
Well, that's a very interesting example because the new cars are going to be data centers themselves, and then the use of that data is going to help for the next car, or all of the information that comes from that in any given nation shouldn't. Yeah, I guess that's a big question. So
already we see this in aircraft. Rolls-Royce no longer, as a prime sales point, sell aero engines. They rent air miles, and they understand their engines better than their customers do, and they know when they're going to break down, and they're testing them all the time. Now you can easily see that sort of technology moving into cars. And that means that if you're going to have a trade arrangement that includes what we've previously seen as old-fashioned physical goods, you've got to have the underpinning data relationship as well.
Can I just follow up on one point that Matt made? You know, fully half of all trade in global services today depends on cross-border data flows, half of it. And yet in the last 6 years, measures to restrict that have doubled. So, you know, we have this phenomenon of our trade is dependent on cross-border data flows, but we have the sort of forced localization and the restrictions that Matt talked about, which really threaten the future underpinning of how we do business with each other.
I want to talk, I mean, we're going to get into that because both of you are involved in negotiations for major trade agreements, the EU and the UK, and of course the sort of NAFTA 2.0. But let me just turn, so Arnaud, how do you see this digital, how do you define it as a sort of, you're a Frenchman who is advising the government of Estonia.
Yeah, but
so that you've got an interesting.
I haven't been traded by the French government to go to. The
Are you? You are a digital.
He's
asset.
full of data. He's a first-round draft pick by the.
But
Estonians.
basically we see, digital trade is just all of the goods or services that are traded online, and of course, from the government of Estonia point of view, we really see it as having tremendous potential to unlock global growth. It can even be like a potential gender equalizer, because we know that there are much more women creating online companies than women owning offline companies. Also, it really empowers people. It empowers individuals, and I think it's 89% of companies doing only digital trade are small or micro companies. So it has a tremendous potential. But since we're talking about the barriers, the main barriers, in my opinion, is the question of access to services and question of access to the right infrastructure and legal and policy framework. And so that's how it's the whole rationale of e-residency program. Actually, we just give the opportunity for anyone from anywhere in the world to have access to Estonia's digital infrastructure. Because
I want to get into that further in a second.
Yes.
I have some questions about that. Marie, so how do you see it? You're a venture capitalist based in France, right?
Absolutely.
So, I mean, you look at companies. I mean, is this when you invest in companies, how important is, I mean, or is it a risk factor or is it an opportunity? I mean, how do you see it?
So as a venture capitalist in Europe, basically the main difference we have with venture capitalists in the US is that when you invest in a startup, the one thing you know is for it to reach scalability, for it to reach critical mass, they will need to go international. They will need to sell outside their home market because there's no European market that is sufficiently big in its local market for a startup to really become scalable and to reach that critical mass and apply some networks effect and to really be able to emphasize the whole power of digital economy. So the main difference we have in Europe compared to the United States is that to really build big companies, we need to go international super quickly. We need to think about our services and our products at an international level right away, you know, and that means that to be able to expand and become as big as a US startup that would have only its local market, we need to have access to all these different markets in an easy way, and that's not the case today. Because with all these different regulations, there's no harmonized local regulations around data, for example, or around everything for taxation, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So if you pass that barrier, which is harder than what you have if you were only on a single market, then you're more armed to go fully international in the US and Asia, etc. So if you reach that, you're in better spot than if you had been born in the US, but it's harder from the start.
It's an interesting, I mean, is it too late though? I mean, when you look at the US, the dominance of technology companies from the United States and some from China, and the sort of relative absence of very large tech firms or, you know, that use data. So give an Alphabet as an example, or Alibaba. Is it too late for Europe to catch up in this regard? We're still debating whether or not you have the standards for digital trade.
Yeah, well, if you look, for example, at everything that blockchain can empower, we're really at the beginning. So this is, for example, a whole space where you can do a lot of things, and the US have not won the battle yet. So there are still some new frontiers in technology and innovation at large where there's still a lot to be done. And what we see in the next generation of startups is that, of course, the first generation in digital was really about re-intermediating, changing the middleman. And the new middlemans are these huge digital platforms instead of physical retailers
the
Facebook, the Amazon, the Google, etc. Right? But now we're in a second generation of startups where what we see is that they're going and tackling industries that need more than just a digital skill. Healthcare, industry, and other type of sectors where actually you will only win if you're capable of course, having digital skills, but also integrating some scientific innovation, a lot of new type of competencies in which Europe is actually super good. So we lost the battle for data today, but there's some new frontiers and some new industries where you will need to have that combinations of skills and of savoir-faire, and where we can maybe play a game if we manage to play that game with incumbents, talking to startups, with research, talking to startups, with all the different players in innovation, being able to do that and come together in building new type of companies.
Matt, you wanted to chime in here?
Yeah, I think that I think that the question that you asked of whether Europe is too far behind to catch up is exactly the wrong way round. actually I think there's a massive opportunity here, because there is a, if you characterize the more laissez-faire approach in the US and the more restrictive approach in China, there's actually an opportunity for for Europe, and certainly we in the UK, to lead in terms of supporting the freedom and the innovation online, but also making sure that it's done in a way that benefits mankind, but as big as that. Right. And in the space of data flows, as we were talking about, this has implications in a lot of areas, but in the space of data flows, for instance, ensuring that you have strong requirements around privacy, whilst at the same time allowing for innovative use of data and artificial intelligence, is something that we have now put in place with a good set of standards around what we call the GDPR. As it happens, that regulation is extraterritorial, so any multinational anywhere in the world that wants to have customers in the European Union is going to have to abide by this standard. And I think that it has the potential to become a global standard, and I can see other countries onboarding. So as we leave the European Union and the UK, we've decided to put the GDPR into domestic law anyway, because we think it's a good standard, but crucially it means that we can then have free flow of data with the rest of the European Union, and I can see other countries taking the same decision to onboard onto these European standards that are essentially a liberal balance, and I mean liberal in the
Small
British
L.
sense, yeah. A liberal balance where we support freedom, but we also protect against the mitigation of harms, as opposed to a more laissez-faire American approach or a more restrictive approach in some countries in the East. So I think there's a big gap in the market for for
I want to talk further about just the bigger picture of Brexit and how this evolves. But Arnaud, you had a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that. Well, first of all, I totally agree with what has been said. And of course, if we talk only in terms of accessing capital, the US have very clear advantage compared to Europe in many ways. However, if we think in terms of accessing infrastructure, the quality of digital infrastructure in Europe is actually very good. The access to internet and all of this kind of like very basic things are much needed for a lot of people who wants to become entrepreneurs, become freelancers, etc. And when we think about a lot of questions related to data flow and protection, the data protection also, and privacy, Europe is pretty much in advance. So I really believe that the way digital trade and the way digital issues are evolving are giving a great opportunity for Europe to move really forward in terms of how to provide like smart regulation and at the same time fair competition. And when it's about artificial intelligence, blockchain technology, or even how to provide a better framework for dealing with trading crypto assets, I really believe that and Europe in general, so including the UK, can really have a clear advantage, and a great one in terms of global trade.
So let's turn to this. You guys are going through a pretty wrenching reform, redrafting all of your relationships with Europe and really the rest of the world. Where does you talked about the GDPR and you talked about the way you've approached it so far, but I mean, where does this whole, you still have a lot of work to do on this front as well, the digital trade front.
Well, of course. Put it this way, the digital revolution that we're living through is bigger than Brexit. Getting the rules of the road right for the digital revolution is mission critical right now. This involves getting the legislative structures right and those bits which are formal regulations. It also involves getting a lot of norms and standards right. There's a big discussion at this conference around the ethical use of AI. Some of that will require legislation, for instance, on privacy, but some of it actually is about having agreed standards that are adhered to that aren't necessarily legislative but become the norm. And the more that they can be global, the better, because the technology by its nature doesn't respect national boundaries. So there's a much bigger question. Now, on Brexit in particular, of course, having the free flow of data after Brexit is very important. We strongly believe it's in the interests of the UK and of the rest of the EU, and I'm confident that we can get that as part of the agreement. and that would underpin digital trade. The wider digital single market project in the EU really is about those data flows. I mean,
can the UK be more laissez-faire? I mean, can it actually go somewhere in between the US and the EU version that we just discussed, or that you referenced? Is there a way to kind of make it a beacon in Europe?
Yeah, well, I would say in tech we already are. I mean, at this conference, the biggest number of delegates comes from the UK. We're undoubtedly the biggest tech hub in Europe. And we have an opportunity because of our some of our long-standing assets, the language, the English law legal system, which is very friendly to innovation, but also the stance of the of policy, which is an exciting low-tax, high talent environment that we try to curate. So yeah, I'm pretty optimistic, and in fact, since the Brexit vote 15 months ago, we've seen increased, not reduced, investment in tech
in the tech sector.
Yeah, so of course, getting the Brexit deal right is important, but it's only a part of getting the rules of the road for this change that is going to affect all of our lives much more than Brexit will.
Scotty, you're involved with the Canadian American Business Council in the great renegotiation, or whatever you want to call it, NAFTA 2.0. NAFTA was one of the first, or the first, sort of real free trade agreement forged between a developed nation, emerging nation. Assuming we get a renegotiation and not some sort of, I don't know, Twitter announcement that it's been ripped up by the President of the United States. Well, I mean, how will this digital trade discussion play? What role will it play in that renegotiation?
Well, it's a big assumption. Donald Trump is to trade policy as Godzilla is to urban planning. So we don't know if there will be a new NAFTA, but let's assume that there will.
Well, there will at least be a Canadian-American NAFTA sort of agreement.
Right, and so the Canadian American Business Council is right in the middle of that, and we appointed a task force, actually, that's chaired by a woman named Lena Trudeau, no relation to Justin Trudeau, but that it has on it members from an AI startup in Canada, as well as Amazon, Google, and then MasterCard and Barrick. So an old school mining company with these modern companies. Anyway, and we've asked them to write what the parameters would be, make recommendations to the negotiators. There's a negotiating round coming up in Mexico City, and so we're doing a soft launch today here at the Web Summit of our negotiating parameters. We base them on a 1909 agreement between Canada and the United States, which is the Boundary Waters Treaty. And water is important to commerce. And at the time when the Boundary Waters Treaty was negotiated, that was the way commerce moved. And we would say that data today is like water. It's important to commerce.
Finds the path of least resistance.
That too. So let me just tell you three of our principles, if I can, and then I'll pause. But our basic principles, and they're not unlike what Matthew has talked about for the UK, but we have three basic principles that underpin our recommendations. One is the reduction of complexity, because trade agreements are really complex. Adding data and technology to them makes them even more so, and we're trying to explain the ideas in a very easy to understand way. The second is we take the long view. That's one of our principles, because as technology changes all the time, you have to have these rules of the road that allow for that, allow for the long view. And then the other thing, we call it Alpha Beta Live, which is digital services are developed iteratively, and they're made better through the incorporation of feedback. And so we are hoping that the new trade agreement will incorporate evolutions in technology and ability and be able to deal with that with principles, so that you're not trying to renegotiate based on last year's kind of trade agreement.
Got it. Okay. Well, good luck with that.
Thank you.
I'm sure the president will be listening. So, Arnaud, let me ask you about, you mentioned this, maybe the solution is e-residency. I don't know what that means. I'm skeptical. It sounded to me like the Saudi Arabians making a robot a citizen, but maybe it's not. Convince me on how this might solve for some of the questions that are being raised in this discussion?
Yeah, well, basically with e-residency, just to summarize in a few words, Estonia is aiming to democratize the access to entrepreneurship worldwide. Because, well, I know it's probably because of our nationalities, the nationalities of people in this panel, but we are very Western focused. And one of the main frontier regarding digital trade is how to make financial and digital inclusion worldwide. Because most of the digital trade right now is made only by countries of the north. Or Western countries and not of the south. So by e-residency, we give the access to our digital infrastructure to anyone from anywhere in the world. So whether you come from India or from Rwanda or from Colombia or wherever, you can become a resident and then create a company in Estonia without actually going to Estonia. You create a company in only a few minutes, and then you have access to all of the tools that are needed to make your company grow. I'm talking about tools because the access of services, and especially digital services, is very unfair. Very often, only because of your nationality or where you live, you can't have access to like very basic services such as.
What do you mean? Like, yeah, what?
For instance, business banking services or international payment providers. And I'm not only talking about developing countries. For instance, if you are Ukrainian entrepreneur or Turkish entrepreneur, you can't get paid by PayPal. You can't have access to this kind of international payment providers. So by creating your company in Estonia, thanks to e-residency, you have access to all of these tools. And all of these tools are really mandatory if you want to be able to manage your company and be totally involved and included in the global digital trade.
But it's not an arbitrage against regulation.
No, I mean your company will have all of the same rights as any Estonian company. At the same time, it's not a tax residency. You still pay your personal taxes where you live, and even regarding corporate taxes, you still pay your corporate taxes where you generate value. And in many cases, those companies don't generate any value in Estonia, so they don't pay their corporate taxes in Estonia. So we just give a key to access our digital infrastructure so that, the ultimate goal is to reach financial and digital inclusion worldwide.
So, Marie, are you an e-resident of Estonia yet?
Not yet.
Are you convinced? You're going to become one?
You know, just to try and learn, we should. All,
right. Okay.
Actually.
So, what can I ask you? You what kinds of companies? I mean, you are the person here for whom the rubber meets the road, right? You are the person who has to make an investment in companies who may or may not be advantaged or disadvantaged by some of the things we're talking about here. Can you give us some color on that? Like, what kinds of companies you think are going to benefit from the right way forward on this?
Let me tell you what I think in the type of general framework that is impacting startups and in general companies that we need to actually deal at the international level. One is everything around data. We talk about free data flow and stuff like that. There's something that is truly important for startups is portability, data portability. Being able, if you build a startup, a music startup, for example, to be able to, for users, just download their favorite playlist from Spotify to another startup company or things like that. Every data that I have inputted to a platform or to another company, being able to get it back and be able to port it to a new startup because I want to choose and be able to basically own my own data and know who has access to it.
You mean as a consumer, as a customer, or you?
But for startups, super important.
Okay.
Because then you're never going to be able to build the same data set than is already done and set in other big companies, right?
Right.
So just for startups, having data portability is a fair and loyal use for the game, for the company game in general. The other fair rule that is totally not there yet for startups is taxation. The bigger, and it's not a question about digital companies or non-digital companies, it's a question of size. And the question of the fact that the taxation system is totally obsolete for digital. Basically, it was built around an economical model that is physical trade. So you're based someplace and you're selling something on a physical way. Today, with the digital economy, it's this third-party system where it's just not working anymore.
Is this what is this get us to the sort of issue with Apple or some of the very, very large tech companies who have managed to essentially game that taxation?
Startups do not have the size to optimize on a taxation level.
So they're at a disadvantage.
They're totally disadvantaged.
Is this part, Matt, of the conversation, the way, I mean, you guys have a lot of things on your plate, but is some sort of normalization or clear rules of engagement on taxation part of this?
Yes, there's international discussions going on about that right now. That isn't an EU issue particularly. Of course, the EU has a strong view, and the Commission takes a view on this. But the OECD is leading international work on this that we were involved in putting on the table, because you've got to have a set of rules that work.
Yeah. Go ahead, Scotty.
Well, one of the things that really enables startups is the investment in the cloud, right? Because you can build for portability and for other things that you're doing. So public sector spending on the cloud actually is an important element. It's not just about taxation. And in the U.S., for example, has a $63 billion public sector investment in the cloud, which is more than the rest of the world combined. The next largest is the EU, which is $19 billion. So I think part of the thing is looking at the infrastructure that we have that is built by the larger companies but enables the growth and development of the smaller companies.
Yeah, and that also raises another problem, which is the data localization.
That's right.
Obviously, for small startups, if you want to start a business in Brazil, for example, and you from scratch need to invest in your local infrastructure, is too hard. But and the other way around, you need to have an applicable law for the countries, right?
That's right, and that's how the trade agreements
there's
can
the
help.
balance to find in terms of how could you truly have your sovereignty in terms of the state, in terms of the law on the data that are set there, but what is the level that you have to put in terms of investment for startups? When do you need your local data server? So having a harmonized and international agreements on being able to have your own law applicable in certain other countries is actually key. So
we come down pretty strongly against data localization.
When you say we,
the Canadian American Business Council, and this work that we're doing on this task force, because we think it's restrictive in a way that doesn't actually enable digital commerce.
Yeah, but the problem is you need to have the law agreement if you don't have localization of data.
That's right. You're right. You have to have rules of the road. I agree.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This sounds like enormously complicated, and yet it's all like policymakers must be just trying to catch up with where we are, Matt. I mean, I would say that the regulation of almost every area of business activity needs to change in the same way, and is being disrupted, if you like, by the technology. And one of the jobs of government is to go through these different regulatory areas and ensure that we have innovation-friendly regulation in each space. So we are legislating now for autonomous vehicles. The Trump administration announced 2 weeks ago that they're going to make a regulatory reform drive for drones. You know, as the new technology arrives, you have to make sure that the framework is put in place that allows the innovation. And we've developed a couple of techniques to do this in the UK that are being copied around the world, around the sandbox idea. This is that the challenge compared to previous technologies is that the technology moves so fast, and regulation by its nature takes time to change, that you've got to make sure it can keep pace. And the idea of the sandbox is that, which we started with fintech, is to say, have an open book approach with the regulator. We actually have an API to allow the exchange of description of activity. And the regulator has the attitude that it's okay so long as you describe to me what you're trying to achieve. And then we'll come and put some more formalized rules around it once it's mature. Right. And this regulatory sandbox approach is really important, and being copied now by other regulators in the UK, looking at different areas like the data regulator, the privacy regulator, because it's important for AI and machine learning, and other jurisdictions around the world. Yeah, it's funny. There's so many things like autonomous vehicles or flying cars. As I had a conversation with a guy yesterday about this. You know, the technology is there, but the systems, the sort of rules, the regulations are. The policies around insurance, whatever you want to go through it, are just
Yes, but you know, in many areas of life, technology is there, but harnessing it for the benefit of citizens it requires a framework to be put in place. Drones is a classic example. You've got to, at one level, you've got to make sure that they don't interact with. Gosh,
crash into.
They're not hit by commercial airlines. At another level, you've got to make sure that they can't overfly somebody's backyard and take photographs. And so, yet there are great applications that are going to improve people's lives because of drones. And so you've got getting this balance it requires not only regulatory change in the pure tech space, in the digital space, but actually right across the
physical space.
Yeah, there's actually something super interesting with drones as well. That illustrates the fact you were talking about, the fact we needed an ethical framework.
Yes.
Well, for example, drones can kill people today. And if you look at Isaac Asimov, the science fiction author, his first rule of robotics, number one, a robot will never harm a human. We have never discussed about some ethical ground for any connected objects or drone or robots or anything. And today things are happening, technology is here, and we have no ethical framework for technology. And that is something that we definitely need to work on today at the international level.
The Terminator rule.
Same thing on the environment.
Yes.
Do you know what the biggest problem of blockchain is? It's consuming the energy of Denmark. It's a catastrophic.
Only Denmark.
Because that's the number. It just evens.
They have enough wind.
Exactly. Denmark is largely powered by renewable energy. So,
but all I'm saying is that we're at a level as well for our planet that it's not only when we discuss about frameworks that we need to discuss about the health of people, we need to discuss about the health of our planet. And understanding in the framework, global framework putting on, it's not only about ethics, it's not only about the human health, it's also about the health of our planet. And technology has never been thought in that framework, and today we definitely need to do it.
It sounds like what we need above all then is some sort of ethical framework for understanding. AI is one of the examples, drones. Yes. I mean, I'm not sure there is such a thing. I mean,
there's about to be.
There's about to be. Who's putting that together?
Well, I'm not sure I'm allowed to announce it at the web summit.
Do it.
But there is a lot of work going on this.
We're breaking news here, folks. So.
Well, what I can say is that
something to get you through the panel.
We have a manifesto commitment to develop a body, both in the UK and working internationally, to try to write some of these rules of the road.
Yeah. Will Donald Trump abide by that?
I have no idea. I'm actually going to facilitate a roundtable on supply chain ethics a little bit later. The one quick question I had for everybody is, in listening to the sandbox approach, which I think is really interesting and important, and the other ideas, what about the protection of intellectual property? Because it seems to me that a IP framework is something that's crucial if you want to innovate. And if I could ask.
Sure, we've got 2 minutes to answer that question.
I'm delighted it came out. It's one of my favorite pet topics, because ultimately market economies require property rights, and increasingly the property rights that matter are intellectual property rights. Right. The whole subject of economics and the definition of intellectual property rules around the world has not yet caught up with the central fact of the digital economy, which is that replication of digital assets is at zero marginal cost.
Yeah.
This is the core intellectual change from the world of where if I have an apple and you eat my apple, I ain't got an apple, to one where if I send you my picture,
I take a picture of your apple and I own the apple.
That's it, and we both got the picture. And so making sure that our intellectual property rules keep pace with this change is mission critical. And crucially, you can't deliver it without the platforms. So what's interesting about, I thought you were very interesting on the discussion of taxation, about how being pro-tech and pro-startup is not always the same as being pro the big platform. And in intellectual property, the protection of intellectual property online is something where the platforms have responsibilities. And yes, we can do this through laws.
So you say... But they haven't yet accepted those.
Well, let me give you an example where they have. For the music industry, there was a deal done, brokered actually by the colleagues in the British government, to demote on search music returns that did not pay royalties, did not abide by intellectual property rules. This was not done on a statutory basis. There was a threat of legislation as it happened, but we didn't need to legislate. By doing the deal, Google and others now demoted in their algorithm worldwide music which doesn't pay its royalties, and therefore they did take responsibility in their algorithm for protecting the content providers' intellectual property.
So they're good citizens in this instance. I'm afraid we are 30 seconds beyond our allotted time, so I would ask you to thank my fantastic panelists for an interesting discussion. There's lots more to discuss on these fronts. Thank you.
Thank you.